Welcome to the Engel Expert Access Series. Our topic today is the future of remote work. We're speaking to Dorinda So, Executive Director at PointA, an organization on a mission to connect people to the places they want to go. Dorinda is an experienced senior executive with a history of working in and with think tanks, executives, and policy leaders. PointA is a nonprofit organization that envisions sustainable transportation options for everyone. They work with members, partners, and funders to facilitate transportation demand management programs and advocate for sustainable transportation. Dorinda, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Robin.
It is great to have you with us. So before we get into the questions on everyone's mind, can you just take a minute to walk me through your background?
Yeah, for sure. So I am right now the executive director of PointA, as you mentioned. And I'm a very good millennial because I've had a lot of different jobs. So worked in all kinds of different industries, worked in government. I spent the last 10 years in nonprofit settings in different industries, but also worked for small businesses, massive, private companies. So I've definitely had my fair share of different kinds of work experiences. And I really enjoy working with all different kinds of leaders, and I have the privilege of working with governments and large workplaces across Canada to help support their employees in commuting more sustainably.
Excellent. Okay, so let's start with a question on everyone's mind. Is remote work here to stay? And if yes, why?
That's a great question. And I think one that a lot of people certainly are trying to figure out, if we could all, take out our crystal balls and figure that out. But I think I usually like to start with figure out what is remote work, just to make sure we're all on the same page, because we kind of throw that word out there a lot. And now increasingly we hear the word hybrid as well. So I usually like to define remote work as any work that you do outside of your usual workplace. So you could be working from home, you could be working in a cafe or a restaurant. In my line of work, I sometimes find myself working on a train, a bus, a subway. That could be working remotely as well. And because PointA has actually been around we're celebrating our 20 years this year, we used to also call it telecommuting, teleworking. We still use those words internally, actually. Or work from home, which I think most of you will probably also use, or in some cases, distributed working, because it's really working across different places and spaces. But it's been something that's been around for a long time, actually. And I know we're all very aware of it with the rise of the pandemic, but it's a tool that we have in our toolkit, because when we're thinking about how to reduce congestion, which is what PointA is all about, remote work is a really great way of reducing congestion. So we've been talking about it for a long time. And now that so many workplaces have adopted it, it is the question of, okay, what's going to happen? Are we going to stay in the state? Or for a lot of you may be wondering, are we going to still be in hybrid forever? And I think that it's a valid question. And depending on what study you look at and what situation or the company that you work for, it may be very different. So I usually like to look at Statistics Canada. I come from a policy and economics background, and I think that Statistics Canada has some good things to say. So they actually predict that going forward, 25% of all work hours in Canada will be done remotely. So it's interesting because they don't say, 25% of people are going to be working remotely. They say work hours. And that's really because the experience that you may have may change over time. Maybe you have a different work schedule than someone else in your office. And so working hours is a really great way of looking at the remote work situation. But it's clear it's here to stay, whether or not it's going to be not a part of your life or 100% of your life. It depends a lot on kind of everyone's situation. And it's very different depending on kind of where you work.
Okay. Wow. Well, so speaking of research, some of the research I dug up said that 87% of respondents stated that remote work options improved their overall work-life balance. And in another survey, 57% of respondents said that they would leave their job if their company didn't offer remote work options. So unfortunately, employees and employers don't seem to be on the same page here. So how do you see the two sides coming together in this on this in a way that both sides are comfortable with remote work going forward?
Yeah, there's a real tension that I think is exacerbated, certainly with a lot of the language with return to office. I mean, employers have spent a lot of money on these really beautiful offices, and in many cases, actually renovated them, retrofitted them during the pandemic so that it's better for workers, whether that they're continuing hybrid or going in office, or even the occasional meeting if they're working from home primarily. So there is that investment. Yet on the other hand, I think employees are really thinking a lot about control over their lives, work-life balance, things that maybe we didn't really think about too much because we had a very predictable standard commute pre-pandemic. Like, no, we have to get to the office by 9 and we leave by 5. So I think that nowadays there are some challenges. And I think the number one thing that we see and hear about as to why this is actually the case is that remote work in many ways creates this lack of feedback loop. So it doesn't really enable employees to tell employers, like, here's how I'm feeling about the way that I'm working. And in some cases, I think employers feel like they're not able to really know what's going on with employees when they're working from home. This is something that we heard a lot about. But I think for us at PointA, we really think about how do we actually bridge this gap? And I think this is why this is a great question, because it is important. So one of the things that we did in just before the pandemic was develop a remote work strategy. And it's something that we actually worked with small businesses across Canada to help them develop starting the end of 2020 and right through to last year. Because one of the things we found is that in order for us to move forward together, we really need to focus on what are the values of your individual organization. When someone agrees to work for you, and certainly the case, I think, pre-pandemic, they wanted to work for you because ultimately they aligned with your values. So this is really where employers and employees actually agree. And so when we're thinking about how do we move forward together in the future of work and what the new normal is going to be and whatever working arrangement that is, I think that it has to be predicated on what your values are and making sure that we're finding alignment on that, as opposed to instead of talking about sometimes like, you know, we go into the weeds around work schedules and things like that. But when we're clear on the strategic alignment, then I think figuring out how you want to work and the many different ways you can configure, whether it's hybrid work or in person or whatever variation of the working environment, that really can come from that. And it's something that we actually help workplaces do today.
Yeah, so get a strategy and be intentional and conscious about your choices there. That's great. That's great advice. Okay, so you talked about Statistics Canada. My next question was, you know, if you looked forward 5 years, what percentage of the workforce do you think will be working remotely? But it sounds like, if I'm reading your previous answer correctly, you're saying approximately 25% of the hours. Is that as far forward as 5 years from now? Do you think that statistic from Statistics Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think going forward, so that percentage could probably change. I mean, we're looking at nationally, it is a probably pretty good number to look at. But I think ultimately, this is a good opportunity for every workplace to consider what does the next 5 years look like. And this is an opportunity to kind of rethink how work is done and to really innovate and try new things. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not workplaces do that and whether or not the 25% does come to pass.
Right. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. What has to change for more people to be able to work remotely?
I think the thing that a lot of the times we really forget is that remote work is fundamentally a different way of working. It's not the same as working in an office. And just because you can bring a laptop home or you somehow lugged your desktop through the snow and you brought it home and you set it up doesn't mean that you're able to work productively at home. And for any kind of workplace, the systems and the structures and the processes that enable work to happen have to actually be remote. So maybe it feels easy to be like, well, we have a phone, we can call each other, and maybe we have Zoom and we can use those tools. But it's also about, you know, if you're accessing files, like, are they still in the office? If you have to photocopy something, like, how are you going to do that? And so with remote work, ultimately, it is a all hands on deck across every single department you could think of, and it affects every aspect of your business. So it is something that is very, very different. And I think a lot of large workplaces have been able to manage just because they have the resources to invest in the IT, the HR, the financial structures and systems, but something that is going to continue to evolve. And it does take time to really figure out. So I think that for every business, it's retooling, rethinking how processes are done so that they can now be done remotely. And in some cases, now you have to be able to have them, be able to do it in the office as well. So it is a challenge for many, but it's the part that often we're not thinking about, and it does significantly impact productivity.
For sure. So do you think remote workers will find it harder to advance their careers as compared to their in-person colleagues? Like, assuming this hybrid world, continues, and some have the choice of going in and working in office as opposed to the choice to work remotely. Do you think that those who choose to work remotely will have their careers slowed down in comparison to their peers who are going into the office every day?
Yeah, a lot of people are very concerned about this, and it goes back to what we're talking about in terms of the feedback loop, because when you are behind a computer screen and your manager doesn't see you, if you have an issue at home, and it could be as simple as like, I don't know how to find this file, or I can't access this. Anytime you kind of quote unquote raise your hand and say, I need help, it's kind of almost a signal to your manager to say like, oh, they're not being productive because they don't know how to do their job. Versus maybe in the actual office environment, a manager can see that maybe something's a little bit off, and they're able to kind of leverage other cues to figure out how you're doing. And also there might be more supports that you can have where it's more informal, right? Like maybe you're heating up your lunch and you're talking to someone and you realize, oh, this person actually can help me with whatever issue I'm dealing with. Can't really do that anymore. And I think what it's done is that it's kind of enabled a lot of different kinds of conversations to happen remotely, but it also, I think, has taken away some of these more these conversations you would have kind of around the water cooler, less formal conversations that really help us kind of move through the workplace, navigate a workplace, and get some help maybe, but also are opportunities for people to move up in their careers. And so I think that when you're looking at remote work, I think workplaces need to consider, how do we have intentional conversations around promotion? What are the markers of productivity, of, the deliverables we want to see in order to kind of move forward or promote somebody? It's a very different way of working. And I think the kinds of cues that managers kind of pick up on to understand, okay, is this person really thriving or are they not? We can't rely on those anymore. And so I think we have to change what the markers of success are. And this is like very hard work. So I think it's still possible, but it does require an intentionality and a change in terms of how people are being measured. And maybe that is going to be different from in person. I also want to mention that for a lot of people who are in hybrid work situations, they might have to kind of have two skill sets, especially if you're going to the office, a couple of days a week, and then you're working from home a couple of days. We do find in studies, they say that you need to have different skill sets, and not everyone has both skill sets, right? Because you have to be very extroverted maybe in person, but then you have to be really vulnerable and be able to like articulate yourself in a written way to kind of get your personality across in when you're working remotely. And so it can be very challenging, and I think it encourages some employees to be like, okay, like this is an opportunity to grow and learn. And for some, it's really challenging. So I do think workplaces are aware of this and hopefully making some changes so that those who are working remotely don't feel like they're being penalized for it, and that they can also be promoted.
That's great insights. So a question that certainly I've thought a lot about, certainly being, having worked in a big event, the Vancouver area, is what's going to happen to all the offices?
Yes, and something that we're seeing a lot of conversations are happening, and I know that even now, certainly we're based in Toronto, our office occupancy still remains relatively low. We're not at 100%. I don't think we're 50% in downtown Toronto. So we know that therefore hybrid is happening and there's not as many office spaces that are being occupied. It's an interesting question because in some cases we've seen in large metros and around the world that a lot of developers are selling their properties or being redeveloped. We're also now hearing of developers that are actually incorporating office spaces into their condos if they're building them. So recognizing that maybe people don't want to work in their actual home, maybe they want to go somewhere. So maybe they'll go to like a second floor or some shared space to be able to work out of. So it really is changing how real estate is working. And I think that at the end of the day, there is a clear desire for many workplaces to return to in-office in some way, shape, or form. But I do think that it is thinking about how we are using spaces differently. We're seeing so much like a rise in the number of like co-working spaces that are coming up and the kind of the mixed use office space situation. So we'll still see a lot of the offices, but maybe it's going to be offices sharing spaces with other companies and different configurations and ways of leases that we've never seen before. But I do think that we're seeing some really cool innovations in how spaces are being used that I think we'll still see them, I think, around. I don't think we'll necessarily see them all disappear.
Well, maybe somehow in all of this, there'll be a increase in affordable housing, which I know is another issue that we certainly were tackling across Canada. Okay, so next question. To what extent will remote work affect where people actually live?
We definitely have seen huge movements of people moving out of very large cities, certainly out of Toronto and Vancouver. We're seeing this across the US as well, where they're moving to kind of what we call like the secondary metros. So places where talking about affordable housing, where it is more affordable to live. And I know that's been a challenge for a lot of people because when they're getting recalled, it's like now they have very long commutes. And in many workplaces, I think accommodate that and say, okay, you can maybe come in like later. But I think in some cases, folks have actually changed jobs as a result. And we saw a lot of that certainly the last couple of years because it may not be actually feasible to come back into the actual office. So I think that the decisions that people are making are certainly more aligned with their personal lifestyle choices, which is really great. I think that's really important. But then also in thinking about, okay, how do we actually get back to the office if we ever need to? So having, access to transportation, transit is still, I think, going to be a really important aspect of where people are making the decision to live. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years because we hear stories of so many people who are very successful with working remotely and living out in places where maybe it is completely different, maybe moving from a city to a country. And as long as they have internet, that they're fine.
Well, I know I live in BC's Okanagan area, and we've seen an enormous influx of folks relocating from the Lower Mainland where they can get more affordable housing and have a better quality of life. So yeah, I've definitely seen it happening firsthand. Okay, so my next question is, how might remote work affect compensation?
Yes. So while I'm not a lawyer or I'm not in HR, to be clear, I think that this is a real question around, what does this look like? Certainly there are, a lot of workplaces will never say like, okay, this is exactly what the implication you should consider because we don't know enough about tax and all those kinds of things. We're not professionals in that space, but that is something that a lot of workplaces do need to consider, right? Where people work and depending on where they work and how long they work there, that can have, everything from like tax to legal implications. So it's something to always consider. But I think as it relates to compensation, it is a good question. Like, do you necessarily make more money because you're working remotely? I think there's a couple of aspects to think about. Increasingly, you'll see HR is actually including remote work or hybrid as part of a total compensation package. So they really do see this as a value add and will actually invest in setting up your home office. So that is adding to that. Even if they don't pay you necessarily more money, it is something that workers desire and actually opens up the talent pool for employers if they're able to incorporate this as part of their compensation package. So I think that in some cases for employers, the added cost of helping to set up a home office is actually not that bad compared to, say, actually increasing someone's pay. And now I think increasingly, because we're also a sustainable transportation commuting business, we think about this. The cost of commuting is a really, really big consideration for people. And not just the cost, but the time. And I think that because the pandemic has really, hopefully, given us all an opportunity to think about what we value, time is now an important factor. So if you're being asked to, have to drive to work because that's the only way to get to work, then that can be a huge cost, not only because the cost of maintaining a car and gas, we know, is like very expensive, but your time has value. And that may be a huge deterrent in why you're not going to take a job. And so this is something that's actually come up. We've seen this across studies, but even pre-pandemic, often commuting is in the top 5 reasons as to why someone leaves their job. I think now it's probably a higher a reason, actually, in terms of what happens. So as it relates to compensation, I really think that considering where people are coming from and what their experience will be, I think will dictate a big part of whether or not they see compensation as fair, and maybe something for employers to consider in supporting any kind of employees who have to come into the office with their commuting costs.
Interesting. So do you think that remote work will cause companies to hire more contractors or more people outside of Canada?
I think it's definitely an opportunity to take advantage of that. Again, as long as you speak to legal, making and all of your accountants to make sure how all of that works out well. And I think that in some ways, for those who are contractors, it's a really good opportunity to have multiple clients and to be able to work across the globe, which is really great. I think on the other hand, one of the things that I personally am always thinking a lot about is the precarity of some of the folks that we've seen. Precarious work was a very big topic of discussion. And I think that the pandemic has actually opened up a very different kind of conversation around precarious employment. And it goes back to why there is a desire for people to want to work from home. That control that they have over their schedules and where they work is something that they've never had before. And now we are seeing contractors and different kinds of workers that are facing precarity. Even anyone has to really go to the office to be able to do their work, I think, is in that category. So I think that there needs to be a real balance in, depending on what kind of contractor, what kind of work is being done, and how to kind of continue to support employees and whoever is working for you, so that we're kind of all moving forward together, as opposed to just being okay, well, this is a really great opportunity to just, cut a lot of costs. So I think there's kind of pros and cons to both.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now the question on everyone's mind with the potential for a recession ahead of us. So what will happen to remote work if, in fact, we go into a recession? Where will this go? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think usually when we're thinking about, a recession, we are thinking about the kind of costs that we are able to cut. I think that's often the first thing. And of course, we're seeing massive layoffs already. And so I think that remote work is actually a really great tool in a way to ensure that folks can still be working. Because I know that a lot of offices might just say, okay, let's just get rid of our office or downsize significantly. And that is going to be really a great opportunity to cut costs. So I think the remote work is going to be a very important tool as we navigate the recession. And it's going to be something that I hope employers see as a way to retain employees, to bring on employees in a really fast manner so that they can kind of get people working. And so I think we'll see more of that as we go forward. And I don't think it's going to decrease. I think it's actually going to probably increase. And we'll probably see a lot of people move from in-person work into remote work because it does open them up to other kinds of opportunities. And we've seen it. In fact, our own organization, we had different people come from very different industries and have been very successful even in a remote work environment. So I do think that there is certainly hope, and I really do hope that remote work is something that's being used to kind of help those who maybe are facing the negative aspects of a recession.
Well, I think the good news is that most organizations have had a couple years to practice at this, and so they it is a weapon in their arsenal to tackle some of the challenges with a recession. So yeah, I could see it definitely increasing in popularity and being put to use more. So that's great insights. Well, that's all the questions I have for you today, Dorinda. So thank you so much for your time. I know that remote work is something that the whole world is trying to navigate these days, and I know that your insights will resonate with all of our listeners. So I appreciate your time, and all the best to you and to the team at PointA.
Thank you so much.